The advanced listening skills of summarizing and paraphrasing help you guide your coachee to allow them to make sense of what they are grappling with. Paraphrasing and summarizing are two related skills required by coaches. By emphasizing the importance of listening and asking questions, summarizing and paraphrasing can sometimes be undervalued, yet they are just as vital to a good coaching conversation. This lesson will explain why they are an essential part of a coach's skill set. It is fair to wonder whether there is any significant difference between summarizing and paraphrasing. Often the words are used interchangeably and are sometimes considered to be synonyms. But they are not. Yet, they both achieve the ability to play back information to the coachee without judgment or without imposing on the coachee's thinking. And it also allows the coachee to hear what they are saying. So by the end of today's lesson, you will be able to utilize paraphrasing in listening, and you will be able to effectively summarize, and you will be able to use appropriate interruptions. Let's kickstart. As coaches, we want to utilize paraphrasing as an advanced listening skill. Because, as Ralph Nichols said, the most basic of all human needs is the need to understand and to be understood. And the best way to understand people is to listen to them. Paraphrasing is the skill that is evidence we have listened. It is the skill that feeds the human need Nichols speaks of in this quotation. When we paraphrase what the person wants or the emotion they are feeling, we also send the message we are fully present and we understand or are trying to understand. Thus, listening and paraphrasing go together, much like bookends for the communication process. Described as the most underutilized skill, and when asked why paraphrasing is not used, these are some of the responses. We learned parroting rather than eloquence in paraphrasing. We are afraid we will get it wrong. Or we might sound inauthentic, more like a pattern of speech we have learned. Due to not practicing paraphrasing and not making it your own, it will remain inauthentic. So here are some good reasons for not allowing these obstacles to keep us from paraphrasing. Neuroscience confirms that keeping people's status high, meaning feeling of importance and worthiness, helps them be more effective and successful. So in coaching, it teaches us to flip the language we use from I to you. The metaphor the study used to illustrate this concept is a flashlight beam or spotlight. So our goal is to keep the beam of light on the other person. So instead of what I hear you saying, which makes it about us, we change the language to you want, your goal, your desire, or your feeling, which makes it all about the other person, giving status and keeping the ray of light focused on the speaker. And worrying about getting the paraphrase wrong, like the obstacle said, is not necessary. We say, when you get it wrong, you actually get it right, because you bring clarity to the conversation. An example that teaches this valuable lesson is where someone came to a coach, visibly upset. The paraphrase was, "You're very angry about the way you were treated in this interaction." And the person responded, "No, I'm not angry. I'm hurt and disappointed." This is beautiful because it still clarified what was talked about, even though the emotional word just wasn't that accurate. Hurt and disappointment are very different from anger. But when we demonstrate a sincere attempt to listen for, the person will sense the intent, feel the safety, and will let you know when you've not hit the nail on the head. It may sound like, "Not exactly," or "Kind of, but what I really meant was." And on the other hand, when you have hit the nail on the head, you may hear "Exactly," or "Yes, that's what I meant, and you said it better than I did." In her book, Fierce Conversations, Susan Scott writes, "Silence is sometimes the answer." In the context of paraphrasing, deliver the paraphrase followed by silence. Do not utter another sentence, and most certainly not a question. Let silence do the heavy lifting. Silence is where thinking lives. It's where I can discover awareness, create my own answers, and consider my next steps. This is where we learn that paraphrasing followed by silence can replace many of our questions. Susie McNeese, an elementary principal, discovered this for herself when she proclaimed, "Today, during a coaching session, I realized that when I wanted to ask clarifying questions, it was for me to try to solve the problem for the other person. Instead, by listening for and paraphrasing, I was allowing the person to solve the problem themselves." When done eloquently, paraphrasing holds the potential for a highly effective communication skill. As said, it can even replace the need for a question. Paraphrasing is evidence of our committed listening. Yet, without our full presence, we cannot paraphrase eloquently. So how do we do this then? By simply listening for what the person wants, the emotion, the passion, options, possibilities, or potential, and what is already working. Paraphrasing can also reframe. It reframes from the negative to positive, problem to solution, complaint to commitment. This demonstrates our full presence for what is of value to the person. Rather than parroting back exactly what the person has said, we go deeper for the essence of what they want, the emotion they are feeling, and to their vision of possibility. When coaching, paraphrasing refers to the act of reflecting back what the coachee has said. The intention is not to provide a succinct account, but to present information back to the coachee in order to check the meaning of what has just been said. So one reason we do this is to raise the awareness of the coachee. And the other reason is to confirm that both the coach and the coachee are talking about the same thing. In coaching, paraphrasing is not about saying something with fewer words. Paraphrasing is particularly helpful when the coachee is exploring their understanding of a situation or coming to terms with a dilemma. For example, the coachee might say, "I don't know, sometimes it feels like people want me to be more decisive, but when I do make a decision, nobody is prepared to support me personally." The coach can paraphrase like, "It sounds like you're not certain about what people want. It feels to you like others want you to be more decisive, but when you behave that way, you don't get any support." Sometimes just hearing back what was said in the voice of another person can provide just the new perspective or insight the coachee needed. There have been many times in my own practice as a coach when I have repeated almost word for word something the coachee has said, and often the response is, "I've never thought of it like that." Yes, it can be surprising to see how some coachees react to their own stories being played back to them. For many, it can seem like it is the first time they have heard an idea, even though the coach is only paraphrasing what the coachee has said. I find myself feeling the need to remind the coachee that it is their words that I'm just reflecting back. Apparently, it can be quite powerful to have someone else vocalize the challenges and situations that are of concern. Paraphrasing is therefore the act of capturing something that a coachee says and then playing it back to them in order to illuminate meaning. Many coachees report that they value the quality thinking time that coaching represents. If they feel overwhelmed in the office or pressured by a busy workplace, a coaching conversation which is less hurried can create the ideal environment for meaningful reflection. So here are some tips when paraphrasing. To do this well, you must listen attentively to the coachee. Also, select statements or thoughts which seem to have significance to the coachee. Do not be afraid of playing back whole phrases or sentences. Start with a phrase that makes it obvious what you're going to do, like, "Can I just check that back with you?" And as far as possible, do not interpret. That is, attach your interpretation to what the coachee has said. And this takes us to our next objective for the lesson, and that is to effectively summarize, which is different than paraphrasing. A summary is then the concise overview of the most important points from a communication, whether it's from a conversation, presentation, or document. Summarizing is a very important skill for an effective communicator. A good summary can verify that people are understanding each other. It can make communications more efficient and can ensure that the highlights of communications are captured and utilized. When summarizing, consider the following guidelines. Listen for the main ideas being conveyed. Look for any other major point that comes from the communication, like a golden thread through it all. What is the person trying to accomplish in this communication? Then organize these main ideas, either just in your mind or write down some notes. And then the summary should always be shorter than the original communication. And do not introduce any new main points when you summarize. Then ask if it is correct. At its simplest level, the skill of summarizing is about listening attentively to what a coachee says and then playing this back to them using fewer words. As with paraphrasing, summarizing can demonstrate the coach is listening. More importantly, a summary can also be used more strategically. For instance, to highlight an aspect of what the coachee has said, or to reframe the coachee's interpretation of a situation. Often it is the coach who is carefully summarizing and playing back their reflections to the coachee, but it may be helpful on occasion to pass this task on to the coachee. For example, if the coachee has been talking about a particularly complex topic or a large number of potential opportunities, let them summarize that. For example, ask them the following questions. For instance, would this be a good point to stop and reflect on what we've covered so far? Or, now that we've talked through the current reality, how would you summarize the situation in 1 or 2 sentences? Yes, summarizing is useful during coaching conversations, and let's look at the following reasons. It demonstrates that the coach is listening. It allows the coach to check their understanding of what has been said. It can refocus the attention of a conversation, and it can be used to reframe the coach's perception of a situation. For example, the coachee might say, "I'm not as confident at work as I used to be. There's a million reasons for this." The coach can summarize and say, "A million reasons?" The coachee can respond, "Well, maybe not a million, but quite a few. First, there are 3 of us who started there together in 2002. Both of the others are now in senior management positions. They've both been promoted twice, and I'm still in the same role. In addition, I've missed some of my performance management targets recently. And even more worryingly, some of my colleagues who used to do great work have been made redundant in the last round of cuts. I guess that all of this overshadows the fact that I do work hard and put in the hours. I don't know, it just feels different. And I'm starting to doubt my own abilities." The coach can summarize and say, "Right. So it sounds like you've recently started to question your own abilities because of a number of things that have been happening at work. You're worried that this doubt is starting to overshadow the good work that you are continuing to deliver. Have I understood this correctly?" An accurate and brief summary of what the coachee has been saying is a good way to minimize the chance of misunderstandings or confusion. This applies to both parties. Sometimes the coach will not have fully grasped the meaning behind a coachee's explanation. In this situation, a summary is a good way of checking understanding, and this can give the coachee an opportunity to clarify what was meant. At other times, a summary can highlight inconsistencies in the coachee's understanding of a situation. In this case, the coachee could reassess their own interpretation of what is happening after they hear the summary. In the example of Christian van Neurberg, in this section of your lesson notes, helps us see that the intentions of summarizing is to invite corrections, cause adaptations, and create elaborations from the coachee. So how do we deliver these summaries? To remember, it is very important that a coach's summary is presented in the most tentative way possible. And summaries should not be presented as fixed or certain. For example, a bad summary might sound like, "Right, so that's fairly clear. You only have 2 options. You've tried one of them already, and you're not prepared to have a go at the other." This is bad because it's less likely to encourage a response from the coachee. Whereas an example of the good summary would sound like, okay, if I've understood correctly, you've identified two options. You've tried one of these and you're not inclined to try the other. Is that about right? This tentative nature of the summarizing may encourage the coachee to engage with what has been said and to move forward. So, coaches should also think about their style of delivery. Gentle delivery and a tentative tone of voice can enhance the value of summarizing. What about you? Do you naturally tend towards being quite categorical when you present your views? Or do you prefer to be more tentative when sharing your thoughts? Whichever your preference, experiment with the other. Observe how each feels in a coaching conversation and note how it will assist you in being more tentative in summarizing in the future. Summaries can also be used as a way of managing a conversation and focusing attention on a particular aspect of what is being discussed. For example, if a coachee decided to talk about their desire to return to college to study art, but spent much of their time talking about how funding for the arts was being cut, summarizing may be a helpful way of bringing the conversation back to its original purpose. For example, the coach could say, okay, so you started by talking about wanting to go back to college to study art. You've also shared your disappointment about government policy in this area. Despite this, you seem to be committed to signing up for an art course in September. Have I understood you correctly? And summaries are also helpful when reframing something that a coachee has said for the purposes of highlighting a particular aspect. For example, if a coachee has been talking in general about their career history without recognizing the importance of their own successes, the coach could highlight these in the summary, saying, so it sounds like you've had a rich career history, including some notable early successes, including being elected Young Entrepreneur of the Year, and then becoming the youngest senior manager within the region. In many ways, coaching is a reframe exercise in itself, and often new insights, learning, and motivation emerge from the coachee seeing their situation in a new frame. Here are some tips when summarizing. If you have concerns about your short-term memory, ask permission to take some notes during a session. Make sure that the summary is a clear, brief version of what the coachee has said. Also, include any unusual words, phrases, or metaphors that the coachee has used. And then include any specific points that the coachee emphasized. Sometimes it is helpful to let the coachee know that you will be summarizing. For example, I think it may be helpful to pause here and summarize what we've talked about so far. And also present your summary in a very tentative manner, remember? Allowing the coachee every possible opportunity to correct, elaborate, or reconsider. And when corrections are made, do not take this personally. Avoid the temptation to defend your summary. This is where it can get a bit complicated. Is it ever okay to interrupt your coachee? The answer is definitely not, and yes, that is part of your role as coach at the same time. In principle, we must show our coachee respect at all times. This includes not interrupting when they are speaking, but this raises a challenge for us as coaches. Ensuring that best use is made of the time available is primarily the coach's responsibility. So where does that leave us? One way to approach this is for coaches to decide beforehand the circumstances in which they might interrupt. So, here are two different types of interruption that are acceptable during coaching conversations. And the first one is procedural interruption, and the other one emphatic interruption. The first type, procedural interruption, relates to interruptions that help to manage the process of the coaching conversation. Timekeeping is the responsibility of the coach, and therefore it may at times be necessary to intervene during the conversation to ensure that it comes to an appropriate conclusion. For example, if there are 10 minutes remaining in the coaching conversation and the coachee starts to revisit information that was already covered in the early stages, a procedural interruption may be appropriate. As an example, remember all interruptions should begin with an apology and an explanation of why the intervention is being made. So a procedural interruption may sound like, "I'm very sorry to intervene, but I've noticed that we have 10 minutes remaining for our conversation. Perhaps we can revisit this topic at a future session. For now, I wonder if you would be okay with us focusing on an action plan to implement before the next time we meet." And then emphatic interruptions. This is when it is important to immediately emphasize something that the coachee has said. Emphatic interruption refers to the purpose of the interruption, the emphasis, rather than the way the coach interrupts. Often coaches will say something of significance as part of a longer exploration of their current situation or preferred future. In some instances, the coach may think it helpful to emphasize these points. There will be times when it may be more appropriate to wait until the coachee comes to a natural conclusion. And there will also be times when it is helpful to highlight the point straight away. For example, if the coachee has been speaking for a good amount of time and says, "Anyway, what I think about this is not important," and carries on talking, the coach may want to emphasize that assertion in order to explore the origin of that view. And it may sound like, "Sorry to intervene, but I noticed that you said that what you think is not important. I wonder if it might be helpful to explore what made you say that." Other occasions for emphatic interruptions are when the coachee overlooks or underplays their strengths, talents, or resourcefulness. For example, if, as part of a longer explanation about their role in an organization, a coachee says, "Because I led on our successful bid to gain investors and people recognition, I never had a chance to be involved in..." It may be helpful for the coach to use an emphatic interruption in that moment, saying, "Sorry to intervene at this point, but I'd like to find out a bit more about what you said. What was your involvement with the investors and people recognition?" This is helpful because it highlights one of the coachee's achievements. Talking about such successes is often motivational and can build energy into a conversation. So as you start practicing paraphrasing and summarizing, here are a few tentative concluding questions you can ask after your paraphrasing or summarizing. First up, did that sound about right? Or, would you say that was a fair summary? Or, have I missed anything? Or, was that an accurate representation of what you said? So, in conclusion, both paraphrasing and summarizing are essential in coaching conversations as they provide a coachee with clear evidence that the coach is listening to them attentively. Paraphrasing is simply repeating back what you have heard, using your own words or sometimes using the coachee's words. Summarizing involves understanding what the coachee has said and playing it back to them in a condensed way. Both are good ways to check our understanding. Coachees should feel comfortable to correcting the coach if they think that the paraphrasing or summarizing does not accurately capture their meaning. And finally, we briefly considered situations in which it may be acceptable to interrupt the coachee. Procedural interruptions when the coach is managing the conversation to get the most benefit from it, and emphatic interruptions when it is important to immediately emphasize something that the coachee has said. This closes our first module in Coaching for Leaders, and I look forward to delve into the next module in your coaching journey around the concept of personal mastery, as we can only take someone as far as we have gone ourselves. See you next time when we kickstart personal mastery with unpacking the beliefs of coaching and its influence on your practice. Until next time.